In my last behind the scenes video, I covered why you might want to consider shooting ProRes RAW, especially for narrative or documentary projects where you may find yourself needing to choose the white balance or ISO values in post after the fact. But there are other reasons that filmmakers may want to consider capturing a scene in ProRes RAW, especially if you're a solo documentary shooter like myself. Camera-savvy Redditors and YouTubers alike have all questioned whether it's worth shooting in a 12-bit RAW codec when your final deliverable is in 8-bit, such as for YouTube. I believe as an engineer that almost every question can be answered through a thorough analysis of the data. So let's dive in. Let's talk about the difference in color spaces between classical 8-bit, modern 10-bit, and modern 12-bit RAW, and whether or not it's worth it for your workflow as a filmmaker. Before we dive into the specs, let's lay down some context. I started my modern professional video career on a Canon 5D Mark II. That's an 8-bit camera capable of capturing 16.7 million colors. Even though it lacked modern features like a 10-bit color space, it still defined a generation of filmmakers and lit a fire deep in many people's hearts. That was the first modern DSLR capable of recording 1080p 30 FPS video. As you might imagine, it was a watershed moment. Fast forwarding to today's world, and I feel like camera progress has become much more incremental. This video isn't about adventuring deep into the weeds, it's about discussing whether or not these changes are noticeable by the average viewer. And to start, we need to talk about some data. In a 10-bit 422 color space, the camera is capable of capturing 1024 shades of red, green, and blue, resulting in a total color depth of 1.07 billion colors. This is a significant increase from the 16.7 million which was capable of being reproduced by the 5D Mark II. However, we can experience yet another quantum leap if we move to the world of 12-bit RAW. 12-bit RAW is capable of capturing and reproducing 67.8 billion individual colors. So in terms of recording, what's the real difference? Well, first of all, file size. File sizes in a RAW signal will be dramatically larger than an internal compressed codec. That's not always bad. Sometimes there's a reason to record in a RAW signal, and I want to examine those reasons now. Let's take a look at a few clips. As we watch these clips, I want to point out a few things. It may seem that one is brighter than the other, however, I assure you they are not. The only changes that I made to these clips in post was to conform the HDR signal into an SDR luminance space. I didn't change the colors at all. I simply made the two images match in terms of overall brightness. The shadows and the highlights should be roughly in the same place on the video signal you're watching, but everything in between is what's different. One thing you might notice is the images captured in ProRes RAW appear to be slightly warmer than their internal counterparts. I believe this is a result of the additional color depth being recorded by the RAW signal. And notably, you can make the RAW signal look like the internal codecs, but it is difficult to go the other direction. Another thing you might notice is that it appears the RAW clips are slightly softer. This is a result of the camera applying no internal sharpening to the signal and instead feeding it directly to my Atomos Ninja Ultra. Now the answer you've all been waiting for is why should I choose RAW recording over an internal compressed codec? I've shown that in many situations the two are comparable, but there will be opportunities where RAW will provide you additional flexibility in post. For starters, it may be useful to capture a scene in ProRes RAW if your subject has a hard backlight or you'll have difficulty pulling their skin tones out of the shadows. These are situations where RAW will provide you additional realism and make the color grading that much easier. Other scenes that may be useful to capture in ProRes RAW are ones where they contain high dynamic range, or the shadows or the highlights contain a lot of color information. Those are difficult to preserve in a 10-bit 422 signal, but I've found it's much easier in a ProRes RAW capture. There are, however, a few trade-offs I should mention before I wrap it up. The first thing you should consider when shooting ProRes RAW is that all noise reduction will need to happen in post. If you have a recent M-series laptop, this isn't an issue, but if you're considering upgrading from an older Intel Mac, I'd recommend you do that before you start shooting ProRes RAW. The second thing I want to bring up is file sizes. If you're working on a short documentary project, such as Earth at Play, you'll need at least 2 terabytes of free disk space to work with the RAW footage and any sort of proxy files that you generate from that. The colors look amazing, but they all come at a cost. If you have any more questions about when would be an appropriate time to consider recording in RAW versus the internal codecs, leave a comment down below and I'll be happy to answer. So there you have it, a few reasons why you might want to consider shooting ProRes RAW, even if you don't believe you'll need to change the exposure or the white balance after the fact. The additional color depth can be a huge asset in post-production, so long as you don't mind the increased file sizes. Once again, thank you so much for watching. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And of course, stay curious.